I like to talk about grading Exam 1. In general, I was fairly happy with the grades. Uh, the average was in the 80s, and there's clearly a linear relationship between people's attendance in class and their scores. The highest grade was a 90%. So in order to correct for that, I shifted the 90 to 100. So everyone received 10 points back on their exam. If you look, there's a red circle with a number, and then that's crossed out. And I think there's a green circle next to it with 10 points higher. And that is the scaled score you have on the exam. If you go page to page, on the bottom of each page, there is a circle number as well. And that circle number is the total number of points on that particular page. And I thought that I'd also talk a little bit about the solutions. So this first problem was graded very strictly, this first problem, because there's really only one way to get this correct. And most people, I say, got it right. And basically, what I was trying to point out was that this whole, in order to be able to section, is superfluous content. It doesn't really add anything except for noise, and it makes the reader have to, skim through all of that and filter it out in order to understand what's being said. And I also wanted to point out that, the subject and the verb, the subject is I, read, to understand. So that's one solution, or the solution. The second problem was a little bit trickier to grade. The main point is that the subject is shape memory alloys. So it has to start with shape memory alloys. And there's two ways to format this problem. One is to say that nickel titanium is an adjective describing shape memory alloys. So nickel titanium shape memory alloys are the best performing and most widely used. Another way is to say the best performing and most widely used modifies shape memory alloy. So the best performing and most widely used shape memory alloys are made of titanium nickel. And then also I took points off for having extra words. And again, the way that I graded this was really to separate into piles based on the readability of the sentence. Most of the perfect 5-point scores, they had this or the reverse, changing the modifiers place. And then we started seeing extra words included in there that I would say required extra filtering and didn't really cut to the point of the sentence. This last problem, I just gave everyone points for that because it was actually extremely difficult to grade this in what I considered a fair fashion. I think that this is a very good example of what I see as a professor coming to me from students. And in fact, I took this straight from someone else's work. So this is an example of what we see. And it's an example of problems and showing kind of what the challenges are to make it more readable. So as I say, everyone got 15 points for this because I thought that it was not really a fair question to grade. Going to the next. So originally I said that it's false. When giving a presentation, your slides should keep the audience's attention because it's not the slides, but it's you that are keeping the attention. But then I realized that, the student is basically understanding that keeping the audience's attention is, kind of the paramount. So I took either true or false for the first problem. Second, the first sentence of a letter should address the background the reader needs to understand why you are writing, is false. The first sentence should be, I'm writing you to apply for a job. I'm writing to inform you. I am writing to request. Why are you writing the person? Make it so that they know exactly what the rest of the letter or the email is going to say. And to give you the opposite, oftentimes I've gotten emails where it starts, last year I was looking at this problem and I thought it was interesting. And by the way, my name is John, and and eventually, 2 paragraphs in, they say, I'd be interested in working with you. And I have to dig to get to that. So first sentence of emails or letters should say what the letter is about. In general, audiences hate seeing equations in presentations. This is a sad truth. It's sad for those of us that are theorists, but it is very true. It's not that you should not have equations in presentations, but use them sparingly and only when you absolutely think they're necessary. True, the key to making a manuscript readable is to have the content well organized, use clear and straightforward grammar. That's absolutely true, and that was the point of those lectures. Acknowledge your collaborators and funding sources at the beginning of your presentation. Some people put them at the end, and a lot of times you see a person giving a presentation and say, oh, and I'm done, and by the way, these people did work too. Don't do that. It's not gracious, and acknowledging the people that have helped you at the very beginning, I think, is both good manners and lends to your credibility as a person that tries to be fair in your work. False. Your ethical decisions should be dictated by the anticipated outcomes of your actions. Ethics, and in particular professional ethics, are about the values that we share. And you're not thinking, well, if I do this, then I'll get fired, or if I do this, this project is going to succeed or not succeed. If you find yourself thinking about, if I, put this plot in my presentation, they're going to, defund my work. They're going to, lay off this engineering team. If you start thinking like that, then you realize that you're asking yourself, should I bend ethics in order to act? And that's not what it's about. We avoid deceptive acts. We try to be as transparent and honest as we can, because that's what it means to be an engineer. This one, your former employer is selling a device that you helped design. You remember that early in the design process, there was a safety problem with one part. You're obligated to or not to make this knowledge public. And the answer is not to. And the reason is that it's a device that your former employer is selling. So you're not working on the product. And second, you know that the safety problem was early. So you don't know what modifications were made between when you were working and what's available now. Making this private content public knowledge without the consent of that company is a problem. It's also a problem if you go straight to the public. We have processes involving, for example, the National Professional Society of Engineers that's supposed to address these type of ethical violations. If you've already, exhausted all of these paths, and you've talked to the former employer and all of that, well, then maybe that's something you have to do. But it's certainly not the first step. And it's something that you have to take into account all of these other actions, including how your actions are going to impact the company, your current employer, and the engineering societies on the whole. True or false? Helping verbs are helpful and should be used, and you should use as many as possible. That was, kind of an attempt at humor on my part. It's supposed to be false. Helping verbs, what I find is that students or writers that use lots of helping verbs oftentimes are using extra words that don't need to be present. So I always consider those as something to look for. It's not that helping verbs are bad. It's just that they are often indicators of other problems in the writing. The short-range consequences of your right or wrong ethical choices may result in your being fired from your job. And again, they're both true. And we talked about that in class. Lastly, the long-range consequences of your right actions is the protection of human society. And this is in part why engineers are important and why it's important that engineers behave in an ethical fashion. Okay, fill in the blank. And there was some flexibility in this. I took most of these as, word for word from either the presentations that I gave or from the Code of Ethics from the NSPE. So ethics is a study of what it means to live a good life. Other terms of good or correct life, anything that implies good. Some people would put in a moral. And the problem with moral is that oftentimes moral and ethical are the same thing. So to say that ethics is a study of what it means to live an ethical life is a little bit redundant. Strictly speaking, moral and ethical are not exactly the same word, but mostly they can be interchanged. Engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Word for word from the Code of Ethics. Engineers shall give credit for the engineering work done to those to whom credit is due. Again, word for word from the Code of Ethics. Rhetoric is the art of persuasive speaking or writing. This was in the presentation. Engineers shall perform service only in areas of their competence. I also took specialization, areas of study, anything that says that what they were trained to do and what they have the ability to do. Engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. Some people wrote unethical, and that's, again, we could also say, engineers shall avoid poisonous snakes, or, falls from high cliffs. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for deceptive. And again, this is something I took word for word from the Code of Ethics. I also took, I think, misleading or false. I think someone might have put lies. And that's the basic idea. You should avoid falsehoods because it's both bad for your client, for yourself, for the engineering community on the whole, and the public. When writing, you should start writing a paragraph with a thesis statement. I also took, I think, an explanation or a goal statement, but basically something that summarizes what the paragraph is about. I think I might have also taken summary statement. I can't remember. Some people wrote opening statement. It's like, well, yes, by definition, the first sentence is the opening statement. So that did not count. The great speaker is able to both present quality content and build rapport with the audience. This came from the notes. Many students also wrote credibility or credentials, and I accepted that as well because I think that's not exactly the word that I was looking for when I wrote the question, but I think it's very true and is part of what we tried to emphasize in that lecture. You make a maximally effective talk when you keep the audience's perspective in mind. If you conduct yourself ethically and you do good engineering work, your employer should indemnify you from litigation. That can also be protect or prevent you from litigation, remove you from litigation, something which says that you are protected against legal claims as long as you are ethical and do good work. Engineers shall not disclose without consent or permission confidential information. Again, word for word from the Code of Ethics. Professional ethics are values that are shared by the community. And this was something that I tried to emphasize in that first lecture, that the difference between personal ethics and professional ethics is that professional ethics are these intrinsic values. They're not extrinsically opposed, but the fact that you're an engineer and you behave like an engineer means that these are pretty much built into you. Possible violations of ethics should be investigated by professional societies. Some people put in NPSE. That's also fine because P is professional. Basically, any society that is associated with your profession, whether it's Materials Research Society, TMS, ASME, if you're a mechanical engineer. When writing a letter of recommendation, you need to establish your credentials with the audience. So anything that says you are trying to establish why you're the right person to be writing this letter. And it could be your background, or it could be your knowledge of the candidate. Here, for proposals or awards, you should address all the criteria given to you by the requester. That can also be requirements, questions, needs, etc. But you have to have all of these, and if you miss even one, oftentimes that excludes you from earning the award or the proposal. Okay, next. Again, when I graded these, I basically separated them into piles based on what I considered the accuracy of the statement. In this first one, I was looking for something about the importance of due process allowing for a just outcome. And that just outcome means that, first we have a good investigation by people that are trained to investigate ethical violations. And second, that we have some type of protection for the accused as well. What is the number one rule when giving an oral presentation? Number one rule, do not waste your audience's time. And again, that was in the presentation, and everything that we talked about with oral presentations is about how do we, cut to, the bone and just present what the audience needs. And it's a lot harder than it sounds, but nonetheless, that is the goal of giving a good presentation. And last here, the difference is that professional ethics are shared values by the community. And that makes it different than personal ethics. It has to have something about community in there, and also I wanted to have something about shared values. And lastly, identify the 5 elements that make this slide terrible. And there were lots of things that made this slide terrible. This is extremely wordy. The font all through this is dreadful. If you look at the plot is small. All of these lines are the same color of gray, essentially, and they have the same symbol, so you can't tell one from the other. We have dash lines. We have no idea what those mean. We have unitless dimensions here, so we have temperature and conductivity, but we don't know if this is centigrade or Fahrenheit, or what the conductivity is. The font size is tiny throughout this. And lastly, this background is really distracting. I mean, if you look at this, we have some line which is cutting through the words and then cuts on either side of the graph. So any combination of these counted for the points on this problem.